Henry VIII had executed 50,000 to 72,000 people during his 36 years of rule over England. You've probably heard this shocking statistic thrown around in documentaries, history classes, and online articles. It's become one of those facts that everyone just accepts. After all, this is the king who chopped off his wives' heads, right? But did Henry really kill that many? Why did he think he needed to kill 72,000 people? And where did this number even come from? Or was this just a centuries-old game of historical telephone, unreliable sources, and outright propaganda? Today, we're going to debunk one of the most persistent myths in Tudor history. We'll trace this bogus number back to its dubious origins, examine what the actual evidence tells us, and discover how a single unreliable claim from the 1570s became historical fact. Because when it comes to Henry VIII's body count, the truth is far more complicated than the myth.
The birth of a myth. In 1959, criminologist Thorsten Sellen published a groundbreaking article in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology titled Two Myths in the History of Capital Punishment. His investigation completely demolished the Henry VIII death toll myth, and yet this bogus number continues to circulate more than 60 years later. Sellen traced the 72,000 figure to its exact source, William Harrison's contribution to Holinshed's Chronicles, published in 1577. In his historical description of the island of Britain, Harrison wrote about criminals and vagabonds, claiming that Henry VIII executed 312,000 of them in his time, meaning 72,000 people, specifically for theft, robbery, and vagrancy. But here's where it gets interesting. Harrison explicitly admitted he didn't witness this himself. He wrote that this information came from Cardane, who writeth it upon the report of the Bishop of Lexovia. So we're already dealing with third-hand information from someone writing 30 years after Henry's death. Jerome Cardan, or Girolamo Cardano, was an Italian mathematician, philosopher, and physician who never actually lived in England. He visited Scotland in 1552 to treat John Hamilton, Archbishop of St. Andrews. On his return journey through London, he met the young King Edward VI and later prepared his horoscope, a document filled with astrological nonsense and dubious historical claims. In this horoscope, Cardan wrote that 2 years before his, Henry VIII's death, as many as 70,000 persons were found to have perished by the hand of the executioner in that one island during his reign. Notice the number has already shifted from Harrison's 72,000 to Cardan's 70,000. But Cardan wasn't even the original source. He got his information from Jacques d'Annebot, the Bishop of Licio, Lexovia, in Latin.
Chapter 2. The Propaganda Problem. To understand why this myth gained traction, we need to understand the political climate of the 1570s when Harrison was writing. Elizabeth I was on the throne, facing constant threats from Catholic powers in Europe. The Spanish Armada was just over a decade away. In this context, portraying the previous Tudor king as a monster served a useful propaganda purpose. It justified the English Reformation and painted Catholics as victims of an inherently violent system. The Bishop of Lisieux, our ultimate source, was a Catholic official who had every incentive to paint Henry VIII in the worst possible light. Henry had, after all, broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and declared himself head of the English Church. From a Catholic perspective, presenting Henry as a mass murderer wasn't just politically useful, it was probably emotionally satisfying. But propaganda isn't history, and we need to examine what the actual records tell us. When modern historians have tried to verify this 72,000 figure, they've run into immediate problems. First, England in the 16th century didn't have the administrative infrastructure to execute that many people. The logistics alone would have been impossible. Consider the math. Henry reigned for 38 years, from 1509 to 1547. If we accept the 72,000 figure, that would mean an average of nearly 1,900 executions per year, or more than 5 people executed every single day for nearly 4 decades. In a country with a population of maybe 3 million people, this would have represented a genocidal level of state violence that would have left contemporary observers traumatized and would have been extensively documented. Yet where are the records of this mass slaughter? Where are the contemporary accounts describing bodies piling up in every market square? They don't exist because the executions didn't happen at this scale.
Chapter 3. What the real evidence shows. When serious historians have tried to count Henry VIII's actual executions, they've come up with numbers that are dramatically lower than the mythical 72,000. The problem is that execution records from the Tudor period are incomplete, scattered across different archives, and often missing entirely. However, we can make some educated estimates based on surviving evidence. Court records, contemporary chronicles, and administrative documents suggest that the actual number of people executed during Henry's reign was probably somewhere between 8,000 and 20,000, a far cry from 72,000, but still significant. Even this lower figure needs context. We should be very clear that Henry VIII did not personally sign the execution warrants of all these people. This number includes everybody who was executed in the country for any capital offense. In Tudor England, you could be executed for theft, vagrancy, heresy, treason, murder, and dozens of other crimes. Many of these executions would have been carried out by local justices and had nothing to do with the king's personal commands. The executions that Henry personally ordered, the high-profile political killings that we associate with his reign, probably numbered in the hundreds, not the thousands. Yes, he executed 2 wives, several close advisors, and numerous political opponents. Yes, he was responsible for brutal crackdowns on religious dissent. But we're talking about hundreds of deaths, not tens of thousands. To put this in perspective, consider that during the English Civil War, 1642–1651, historians estimate that around 200,000 people died, and that was considered one of the most devastating conflicts in English history. The idea that Henry VIII quietly executed 72,000 people without anyone noticing stretches credibility beyond the breaking point.
Chapter 4. How Myths Become Facts. So how did Harrison's unsourced claim from the 1570s become accepted historical fact? The answer lies in how historical knowledge was transmitted over the centuries. David Hume, the famous Scottish philosopher and historian, included Harrison's statistics in his History of England, from the invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution in 1688–1882 edition. Hume's endorsement gave the claim serious academic weight. The myth received even more prominence when Samuel Romilly repeated it during a debate on the death penalty in the House of Commons on February 9, 1810. Having Hume and Romilly cite the figure made it seem like established historical fact rather than unsubstantiated gossip. By the Victorian era, the 72,000 figure had become so widely repeated that it was treated as established fact. Victorian historians, writing in an age of imperial expansion and industrial progress, were often eager to portray the medieval and early modern periods as brutal and backwards. The idea that Henry VIII had executed 72,000 people fit perfectly into this narrative of historical progress. The myth was further reinforced by popular culture. Historical novels, plays, and eventually films and television shows repeated the 72,000 figure because it made for dramatic storytelling. Who wants to hear that Henry VIII was merely moderately violent when you can claim he was one of history's great mass murderers? A single unreliable source makes an unverifiable claim. That claim gets repeated by influential works. Later historians cite those works without checking the original sources. Popular culture embraces the dramatic version. Eventually, the myth becomes so widespread that questioning it seems pedantic.
Chapter 5. The Real Henry VIII. None of this is to say that Henry VIII was a gentle, misunderstood monarch. He was absolutely responsible for numerous executions, and many of them were brutal and unjust. The dissolutions of the monasteries displaced thousands of people and destroyed centuries of religious and cultural heritage. His treatment of his wives ranged from neglectful to murderous. His religious policies tore English society apart and led to decades of sectarian violence. But historical accuracy matters, and the difference between executing hundreds of people and executing tens of thousands is not just a matter of degree, it's a matter of fundamental historical understanding. Henry VIII was a Renaissance monarch who used violence as a political tool, just like his contemporaries across Europe. He was paranoid about threats to his dynasty, ruthless toward political opponents, and willing to execute anyone who stood in his way. But he was not conducting genocide against his own people. When we perpetuate myths like the 72,000 death toll, we actually make it harder to understand the real Henry VIII and the genuine problems of his reign. We turn a complex historical figure into a cartoon villain, which might make for good entertainment but terrible history. The real story of Tudor executions is actually more interesting than the myth. It's a story about how early modern states developed bureaucratic systems of violence, how religious change created new categories of criminals, and how monarchical authority was enforced through spectacular public punishment. But none of that complexity survives when we reduce it to a single fabricated number.
The myth of Henry VIII's 72,000 victims has persisted for over 400 years because it tells people what they want to believe about the past. It confirms our assumptions about royal tyranny, medieval brutality, and historical progress. But history isn't about confirming our assumptions, it's about understanding what actually happened based on the best available evidence. Henry VIII was indeed responsible for many executions, and his reign saw significant political violence. The dissolution of the monasteries, the executions of Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, the brutal suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace, these were real events with real victims. We don't need to inflate the numbers to understand that Henry could be ruthless and cruel. But when we accept mythical statistics without question, we're not just getting the facts wrong, we're missing opportunities to understand the real complexities of Tudor England. The true story of crime and punishment in the 16th century is fascinating enough without fictional body counts. The next time someone tells you that Henry VIII executed 72,000 people, you can confidently tell them they're repeating a 400-year-old myth based on third-hand gossip from a French Catholic bishop. Thorsten Selin proved this definitively more than 60 years ago. The real tragedy is that so few people know about his work. History is too important to be left to mythmakers, and the truth, however complex and inconvenient, is always more valuable than the legend. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical myth-busting, make sure to subscribe for more videos debunking the misunderstood fact of the royal family. What other historical facts would you like to see investigated? Let me know in the comments below.